Hi, welcome to the second lesson in our Intro to Spring Boot series. We learned in the last lesson the basic mechanics of getting a Spring Boot application running and setting up a simple controller with one or two little handler methods within that controller. In this lesson, we're going to look at some of the basics of routing within Spring Boot applications. And so routing is basically the mechanism by which a request path gets routed to a controller within our application. Okay, so here's kind of a rundown of the topics we're going to look at. So we're going to look at customizing routes with the request mapping annotation. We saw how to use this annotation in its most basic form in the last lesson to specify which path a handler method should be handling requests at. We're going to see how to use it at the controller level and also how to add a little bit more detail to it to have more control over the mapping behavior. We're going to look at how we can declare HTTP request types so that we can specify that a handler method can respond to either just GET or just POST requests. And we're also going to look at how we can pass parameters into our handler methods. So there are three ways we can do this. The first is using a GET request and using query parameters as part of the request path. Remember, query parameter is the question mark followed by parameters and key value pairs. We'll look at specific examples of that. We'll look at how to pass post parameters into our handler methods and deal with those post parameters. And then we'll also look at using what are called URL segments to pass data into our controllers as well. So just to revisit, here we are with the MVC flow, and the routing portion of Spring Boot is something that's part of the machinery of the framework that we're really just going to be using and configuring. It happens when a request comes in. So down here at the bottom of the diagram, we see that a browser makes a request to a web server. In our case, that web server is called Tomcat, and it's kind of wrapped up inside of our Spring Boot application, and it starts up for us when we want it to run. When the web server receives that request, it's going to unpack it. So you can think of an HTTP request, a nice visual analogy is that it's an envelope, okay? So an envelope that's been sent by US mail will have an address. It will have a return to sender address. It will have, you can open it up and there will be a message inside. There's a lot of different types of data that specify how that message is to be sent, who's to receive it, who sent it, and what they're actually sending. So the web server, along with the framework, will really unpack that request. It'll look at what's being requested from the web server, what are the parameters and the data that's been passed with that request. And from that information, it will figure out which controller should be handling that request. So we're just going to look at how we can configure our controllers to handle the right types of requests. All right, let's bounce back over to IntelliJ. I'm actually going to exit out of this. So here's where we left off last time. We had one controller called Hello Controller. It was configured with the @controller annotation in order to tell Spring Boot that we wanted this class to be recognized as a controller class. It was each handler within that was configured with the request mapping annotation to tell Spring Boot which URL or which path our handlers should be receiving requests at. And then for these particular situations where we're returning plain text, we added the response body annotation to specify that we want to return plain text. So we'll pretty quickly get to views and templates. That's coming up in the next group of lessons. But for now, we're just going to return text directly from our controllers. So one thing I want to show you how to do is how you can set request mapping at the controller level. So I can put request mapping up here. And I can specify that maybe I want every request into this controller to be preceded by the segment hello. Okay, so let's go ahead and run our application, and we'll see how this has altered the request path structure for these handlers. All right, I see my application started message right there, which means I'm safe to bounce back over here So previously, recall that we had at the base path for our application, we had the message hello world. Okay, if I go to that base path now and hit enter, I get an error page. That's because I've modified the path at which this index handler, is listening. Rather than this empty path segment, rather than being at the root now, it has to be preceded by the request mapping segment that's configured here at the controller. So now I have to go to /hello. And that's where I see the hello world message. Similarly, down here where I have the request mapping value goodbye for this handler, I need to precede that by hello as well. Okay, so it's pretty handy to group controllers by functionality within your application, and it's a pretty frequent thing to want to say that all controllers within a class, or all controller methods within a controller class, live below a certain URL segment. Okay, so for this example, we're not going to really use that. When our applications become bigger and more complicated, we definitely will. But for now, you can just get rid of that. That was simply to illustrate a point. All right, so now let's look at how we can handle parameters within our applications. Okay, so we want to look at the different ways that our handler methods can receive data via an HTTP request. So the first that we said we were going to look into is how we can receive query parameters. All right, so a query parameter would be something of the form question mark and then with a key value pair. So here's what I would like my application to do. Here's the direction we're going in. I would like my application, when I give it a query parameter with a name on it, to respond, and instead of saying hello world, I would like it to greet me by name, to say hello Chris. Okay, so that's the first task we want to implement. So let's go back here. Let's go ahead and stop our server because we're going to need to restart it after we change code. Okay, so to do this, I need to be able to somehow get the parameters that are passed into the server via that query string. So to do that, I'm going to add an input parameter to my index method. And in particular, if I can spell properly, I want HTTP servlet request. And again, you might have to import or add follow the add to class path message that's provided there. But the type of our request is HTTP servlet request. Okay, so now I have an object in my method. Spring will go ahead and pass this to me. So Spring is what's actually calling my index method when a proper request comes in that should be routed to this handler. So Spring is going to give my method this request. And that's kind of a little black boxy. It's kind of a little magical, but it's the way the framework is set up to work. When I get this request is an object that represents the data that's in the HTTP request that the server received. So I receive this request, and I can then get data out of it. So in particular, I'm hoping that there's a name in here. So I can say string name equals request.get parameter, and then I have to give it the key of the parameter that I want to get out of the request. Okay, so if all goes well, this name variable, this local name variable, will be the value that was passed in via the query string right here. So notice that this key has to match this key as well. I could name this something else. I could say, user name. These don't have to match. What has to match is the key I'm using it to get the data out of the request with the key that was used in the query string. Okay. And then down here, instead of saying hello world, I will say hello to that person. Okay, so let's go ahead and start our application up and see how we did. Okay, once it's finished booting, we can come back here and I can just submit that request. Oops. And depending on your browser, hopefully that won't happen. I have mine set up, configured in a specific way. Let's say, there we go. Great. So notice that the controller did indeed get this piece of data out of the request. I can change it, right? And that responds appropriately. So each time I change it, the controller will get that corresponding piece of data out of the request and then use that to format the response. So you can use this basic mechanism to pass any number of parameters that you want in a query string and then to get them out of a request by adding the HTTP servlet request object to your method's input parameters and then using request.getParameter to pull those parameters out. So one question I have that I would like to kind of pose and that we'll explore is what happens if I don't actually pass this parameter? What's going to happen with within my method call? To answer this, I'm going to use an approach that I want you to go ahead and use when you have these types of questions, which is to try it out. In particular, I'm going to put a breakpoint right here, and I'm going to start my server in debug mode. So we talked about debugging our plain Java applications in a previous lesson. You can use the same approach to debug Spring applications as well. So you can set breakpoints, and you can start your server in debug mode, and then control the execution and look at the runtime state of your application the same way you would with plain Java applications. Okay, so we finished starting up. Let's go back here. So I'm gonna just take off this stuff from the URL, submit the request again. I've hit the breakpoint, and let's see what we have. So in my variables pane, I have two variables, this and request. This is something that we'll explore what that means when we get to the lesson in about a week or so on classes and objects in Java. But we have the request object here. That's a local variable within our method. And if you want to see what's in there, this is always interesting to do, to see what's available to you as a programmer. You can dive down into this this object and see all the different data that it has within it. Okay, not that important to us right now. Let's go ahead and step over this line of code so we can see what comes out when I try to get the parameter name from the request when there isn't one. Okay, so here we go. So here we have name is equal to null. If I ask for a parameter out of a request and that parameter was not sent in as part of that request, then I'm going to get null back out. Okay, so that's a good thing to know. So nulls are generally, you don't want to try to call a method on a null object. So that's a bad thing to do. In this case, we can play this out. And we can see that this is just going to print out hello null. So somewhat harmless. Our application didn't blow up or anything. But nulls are pretty dangerous in Java. You generally want to be aware of when it's possible for a value that you're working with to be null and to safeguard against that. So let's provide a little safeguard here. Let's go ahead and stop our application. And I'm going to take the breakpoint out. What I'm going to do here is just add a little null check. I'm going to say if name equals null, name equals world. So this way, if the user doesn't pass in a parameter, I can just greet them with hello world. Okay, so we started it up. Let's test it out. There we go. We have hello world, and so we still need to test out the other use case to make sure we didn't break anything. And again, I did that again. Sorry about that. I'll try to change my browser settings here for future lessons. There we go. So indeed, that works. To properly check for the value of the parameter, and if it's null, to insert a default value. Okay, so a good thing to do to be careful with the inputs that your application is using, and to make sure that if it's possible for them to be null, that you're safeguarding against that. Okay, so that's how we handle query parameters. Let's look at our next task, which is to figure out how to handle post parameters. So this is going to be sort of a two-step process. I'm going to stop my server. I am going to need to display a form that allows the user to submit a request. So that's the first part. I want to create a new request handler. So I'm going to say public string hello form. Okay. And we will want to just build up a string to return some HTML. So I'm going to make string HTML. I'm going to set this equal to, and I'm just going to just literally type the HTML in here that I need. I want to make sure that my form is posting, so I say method equals post. Within IntelliJ, you can hit enter within a string, and it will automatically close that string, add a plus sign, and then take you down to the next line, so you can make multi-line strings very easily. I'm going to say that my input has type equal text, and it's going to be called name. Then I need to add a submit button. And I'm going to customize the little message that's on the submit button. And then I need to close my form. Okay. And then I just need to be able to return my HTML. Oops, misspelled return. All right, so we're not quite done yet. We haven't configured this handler to be an actual handler. We need to add these two annotations to it, the request mapping. And I'm going to put this at a different path so I can keep my old handler. So let's say I want this to be at /hello. And I still need to add the response body because we're not using templates yet. Oops, and I used the wrong name for my annotation here. There we go, request mapping. All right, so what I've done here is I've just created a handler that will just return the minimum amount of HTML to display a form. Now, normally we wouldn't want to return HTML that didn't have the HTML tags and the head and the body and all that proper formatting. In this case, though, we're going to kind of skimp on that because we'll get to templates later, and that'll make it reasonable for us to do all those things. Here, we're just kind of illustrating the mechanics of forms and routing and parameter passing, and so we're going to skip over that stuff. Great, so now I want to be able to handle requests that are submitted from this form. All right, so I want to put that logic in a separate handler. So I'm going to create another public string. Let's call this hello post. Not the best name in the world. And within this method, I'm going to have this live at the same exact URL as my form handler method, the one that displays the form rather. But I want this to be a post method. Okay, I want it to handle post requests. So I can add, I want it to handle post requests. So I can add a second parameter here that says method equals request method dot post. Okay. And similarly, I can put up here method equals request method dot get. And so this specifies that the method that's going to display the form should only respond to get requests, and the method that's going to receive the data from the form and process it should only respond to post requests. Okay, so as before, when I was getting parameters via a get request up here, I need to have access to the request object. So I need to add this parameter HTTP servlet request as an input parameter to my hello post method. That way I'll be able to get the data out of the request. All right, so let me just do that, and I'll in fact mimic the same thing I did above. String name equals request dot get parameter name. And again, this key here, name, has to match this key in the form. If I had multiple form inputs, I would have to give them different names, and I would have to get them out with their corresponding keys. Okay? And then I can do a similar thing here. I can say return hello name. And we're going to go forgo the null check here. We've already talked about how to do that. We really want to focus on handling the inputs via a post request. All right, so let's go ahead and start our server up and see how we did. So once it gets done loading, note that we're going to have to go to /hello here because that's how we configured our route. And indeed, we get a form. This is the response we received from requesting the /hello resource, and that form was returned right there. And then let's just go ahead and submit it. And there we go. So we see that we received the response we were expected, which is that the name that was typed into the form is part of the greeting. And so let's just review what happened there. So if we go back to the form and I put in a different name, right? And then I say greet me, what happens when I hit that button is that the request is sent to /hello. Okay, so why is the post request sent to /hello? That's because I left the action parameter off of this form. All right, recall from our discussion of forms that you have an action parameter that you can use to customize the location or the URL that the form is posted to. If you leave that action off, by default, the form will post to the exact same URL that the form is displayed at. So in this case, the form is displayed at /hello. It's going to post to /hello. The reason why that request gets routed to this second method is that I've configured the first one to only handle get requests and the second one to only handle post requests. Okay, so the second request, when I submit the form, since it's a post request, right, since I've configured the method equal post on the form, that post request will be routed to hello post. Within that handler, I then get the name parameter out of the request, format my response message, and return it to the user. Okay, so there we go. I see. That probably did not work since I left off some formatting. Okay. So that's how we can handle post request parameters to our controllers. Let's talk next about how a third way we can pass data into a controller and into a handler method, which is via what's called a URL segment. So what's a URL segment? We've seen these at least once before, but let me show you what they look like. So I can make a URL that looks like this, that has /hello/Chris, where Chris is intended to be not part of the path to the controller that we want to hit, but it's supposed to be part of the data that is passed into that controller in those handler methods. So I want this second URL segment here. A URL segment is just a portion of a URL. I want that URL segment to function as data that's passed into the handler inside the controller rather than part of the route, okay? So let's look at how we can do that. So I'm going to, again, go down here and make a new handler method. Let me call this, let's say it's public string and hello URL segment. All right, again, not a great name, but it's descriptive of at least the use case we're looking at right here. And again, to configure this, I need to add a request mapping. All right, we'll come back to that in a second, and I also want to add a response body. So the request mapping, this the configuration of this, where we set up the route that we want this handler to live at, this is a little bit nuanced because we want this to actually, this is where we specify how the data that's part of the URL segment right there gets passed into our handler method. And so I can do that by saying that I want this to go to /hello/name, where name is contained in curly braces. And that says basically that name should be a parameter for the handler method, okay? So down here, there's one more piece of code I need to insert to really make this work, which is I need to say that I need a string name as an input parameter, and I need to specify via an annotation that this is a path variable. Okay, so I use the @path variable in front of my parameter declaration here, string name, to say that Spring should get the value of this parameter from a variable that is in the path right there. So this name here has to match this name here. These two values have to be the same. And this annotation is what tells Spring to look for the value of this input parameter in the URL segment. Okay, and then once I'm in there, this code is actually going to be shorter than previous methods because I already have a variable with the name in it, so I can literally just return hello name. I don't have to get it out of the request because Spring will handle that piece for me. All right, let's go ahead and start our application up, or restart it if you didn't stop it from last time, and we'll see if this works. All right, there we are. We booted up. And let's go here and hit enter. And we see that seems to have worked. I have /hello/my name, and I am greeted by name. Let's do something else. All right, there we go. What happens if I were to leave off the name here? So think about that for a second. Think about your hypothesis around what happens if I leave it off. So there's kind of two possibilities. One is that we might hit this controller right here that we just set up, and name might be null. That's one possibility. The other possibility, though, is that we've actually set up another method to respond to a URL that looks like that as well. So form a hypothesis, try it out. There we go. So there's a hierarchy of rules that Spring will use to determine routing, right? So you can't have, say, two handler methods that respond to the same situation, but you can have these URL routing situations that are very similar. And the only difference here between /hello and /hello/somebody's name is the data that's passed in. Whoops. The data that's passed in. And so the container and the framework are smart enough to unpack that data and to figure out which controller should properly receive that based on the way we've configured our controllers. So, a big part of getting used to Spring Boot and to setting up your applications is going to be learning these routing rules and using them appropriately to make sure that you're hitting the right controller class when you make a certain request. So there's one more thing I want to show you that has to do with routing as we wrap up this lesson, which is how to redirect. So we've talked about redirects in other portions of the class. What I want to do here is from this goodbye handler, I want to send a redirect that actually sends somebody to the hello handler way up at the top, the first one that we inserted, right? That greets somebody either by name or hello world if they leave off the name. So to do that, let me take off the response body. So if I'm going to redirect, that means I'm not returning text as part of the response body. I'm going to return a redirect status code. And then here I can say redirect slash. All right, so that says redirect them to the root URL path on the server. And once we're started up, we can go back and test this out. So we're testing that when I type in the path goodbye, I get redirected to the root path. And that is indeed what happens. Okay, there you go. So that's how you can redirect. So those are some of just the most, the most essential core ways to pass data around and to handle requests and to configure routing. There are a lot more situations that you might encounter. I think the methodology of this portion of the class is to teach you sort of the things that are going to cover the 75 or 90% of the use cases that you might encounter when working on one of your projects, and then kind of give you enough information that when you encounter one of those more specialized cases, you're able to go out and learn about it and figure out how to use that additional use case. We're not going to be able to cover every single way that you could configure your Spring application to work in this class, of course. So we're going to cover the most important ways and give you the background needed so that you can learn about those additional ways on a case-by-case basis, which is really how professional programmers work. So we hope that this lesson is useful, and now you understand the basics of controllers and routing and parameter passing within Spring Boot.